The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden platform of Cedar Ridge Station as Margaret Sullivan clutched her worn leather satchel with trembling fingers. The white dress she wore, carefully mended and pressed the night before, felt heavy against her skin despite the rising heat. Her veil, a delicate piece of lace that had belonged to her grandmother, hung lower than tradition demanded, carefully positioned to conceal the left side of her face where angry red scars twisted from her temple to her jaw. The train whistle echoed across the dusty plains, growing fainter with each passing moment as the locomotive disappeared into the horizon, taking with it her last connection to the life she'd known. Margaret had traveled 3 days from Kansas City to meet Thomas Whitmore, a rancher who had answered her advertisement in the matrimonial newspaper. Their correspondence had been brief but cordial, filled with practical discussions about ranch life and mutual expectations. She had been honest about many things: her ability to cook Sioux and manage a household, her willingness to work hard, her desire for a family. But she had not been honest about the fire. The memory of that terrible night 6 months ago still haunted her dreams. The boarding house where she worked had caught fire, and she had barely escaped with her life. The left side of her face bore the permanent reminder of flames that had stolen not just her beauty, but her confidence, her prospects, and nearly her will to live. The other residents had looked at her with a mixture of pity and revulsion afterward, and she knew she could not remain where she was a constant reminder of tragedy. Now, standing alone on the platform with her single bag and her shattered dreams, Margaret felt the weight of her deception crushing down upon her. Thomas Whitmore had been expecting a bride, but one look at her face would surely send him running like all the others. She had pinned everything on this chance, sold her few possessions to buy the train ticket, and written to tell him she would arrive on the morning train. But as the minutes ticked by and no one came to meet her, she began to understand that perhaps he had somehow learned the truth about her appearance. The station master, a kindly older gentleman with wire-rimmed spectacles, approached her with obvious concern. "Miss, you've been standing here near an hour now. Is someone coming to fetch you?" Margaret's voice caught in her throat as she tried to respond. I was supposed to meet someone, Mr. Thomas Whitmore. Perhaps he's been delayed." The station master's expression grew uncomfortable, and he glanced away before speaking. "Miss, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Tom Whitmore was here earlier. He asked me to give you this." He handed her a sealed envelope with her name written in hasty script across the front. With hands that shook like autumn leaves, Margaret tore open the envelope and read the brief note inside. The words blurred through her tears, but their meaning was clear enough. Thomas had seen her step off the train from across the street, had seen her scars despite the veil, and had decided he could not go through with the arrangement. He apologized for any inconvenience and wished her well, but made it clear that she should take the next train back east. The station master cleared his throat awkwardly. "The next eastbound train won't be through for 3 days, miss. There's a boarding house in town, Mrs. Henderson's place. She's a good Christian woman. Might give you a room." Margaret nodded numbly, unable to trust her voice. She picked up her satchel and walked slowly into the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, feeling the curious stares of townspeople who had nothing better to do than gawk at a stranger in a wedding dress. The sun beat down mercilessly, and by the time she reached the boarding house, perspiration had soaked through her dress and her veil clung uncomfortably to her face. Mrs. Henderson was indeed a kind woman, round and motherly with flour-dusted hands and eyes full of compassion. She took one look at Margaret's tear-stained face and drawn expression and ushered her inside without question. "Come in, dear, come in. You look like you've had a hard day of it." Margaret explained her situation as simply as possible, and Mrs. Henderson tasked sympathetically while preparing a cup of tea. "Men can be fools, child. Absolute fools. But you're welcome here as long as you need. I could use help in the kitchen if you're looking to earn your keep." That evening, as Margaret sat in her small but clean room above the boarding house, she stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror above the washstand. The scars seemed even more prominent in the lamplight, a twisted landscape of pink and red flesh that transformed what had once been a pleasant face into something people turned away from. She had learned to arrange her hair to partially cover the damage, to keep to the shadowed side of rooms, to speak softly so people might focus on her words rather than her appearance. But none of it seemed to matter anymore. She was 24 years old, alone in the world, and marked by tragedy in a way that seemed to define her entire existence. The dreams she had harbored of a family, children, a home of her own, all seemed as distant now as the stars visible through her window. She wept quietly into her pillow that night, mourning not just for the marriage that would never be, but for the life she feared she would never have. Margaret had been working at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house for nearly a week when she first saw him. She was hanging laundry in the small yard behind the building, her face turned away from the street out of habit, when she heard the slow clop of a horse's hooves on the dusty road. Something made her glance up, and she found herself looking at a man unlike any she had ever seen. He sat tall in his saddle despite the obvious pain it caused him, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, clearly damaged beyond repair. But it was his face that held her attention. The right side was ruggedly handsome, with strong features and kind brown eyes. The left side was a ruin of scar tissue, far worse than her own injuries, as if he had been caught in an explosion or dragged across rough ground. His hat was pulled low, casting shadows that partially concealed the damage, but Margaret could see enough to recognize a kindred spirit. Their eyes met for just a moment across the yard, and she saw something in his gaze that she had not encountered since her accident. Not pity, not revulsion, but simple recognition. He touched the brim of his hat in a polite greeting and continued on his way, but something about that brief exchange stayed with her for the rest of the day. "That's Jake Morrison," Mrs. Henderson explained when Margaret finally worked up the courage to ask. "Fought in the war, came back all broken up. He's got a small ranch about 5 miles out of town, runs a few head of cattle, keeps to himself mostly, comes into town for supplies maybe once a week. Folks say he was quite the charmer before the war, had half the young women in 3 counties setting their caps for him. Different story now, of course." Margaret found herself watching for him during the following weeks, though she was careful not to be obvious about it. Jake Morrison came to town like clockwork every Saturday morning, riding the same route past the boarding house. Sometimes their eyes would meet, and he would tip his hat, but they never spoke. Margaret learned from the other women in town that he had been engaged before the war to the banker's daughter, but she had broken off the engagement when he returned home wounded. He had been living alone on his ranch for nearly 3 years now, rarely socializing and never courting. The more Margaret learned about Jake Morrison, the more she found herself thinking about him. Here was a man who understood what it meant to be marked by tragedy, to have dreams shattered by circumstances beyond his control. She wondered if he felt the same crushing loneliness that weighed on her chest like a stone, if he lay awake at night wondering if anyone would ever see past his scars to the person underneath. One Saturday morning in late September, Margaret was sweeping the front porch when she saw Jake's horse standing riderless in the street. She looked around frantically and spotted him lying motionless beside the water trough, his hat several feet away and blood seeping from a gash on his forehead. Without thinking, she dropped her broom and ran to his side. "Sir, Mr. Morrison." She knelt beside him, her hands hovering uncertainly over his still form. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was shallow but steady. The scar tissue on the left side of his face was even more extensive up close, but Margaret felt no revulsion, only concern. She had learned to see past such things. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then settling on her face. She had forgotten to position herself carefully, and he was seeing her scars in full daylight for the first time. She instinctively turned away, but his good hand reached up and gently touched her arm. "Don't," he said softly, his voice rough from pain. "Don't hide from me." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes at the kindness in his voice. She helped him sit up slowly, supporting his weight as he struggled to regain his bearings. "What happened? Should I fetch the doctor?" Horse spooked at something. "I lost my balance." He touched his forehead gingerly and winced. "Been happening more often lately. War left me with some balance problems along with everything else." Margaret helped him to his feet, and they walked slowly back to the boarding house where Mrs. Henderson fussed over him like a mother hen. She cleaned his wound and insisted he stay for lunch, and somehow Margaret found herself sitting across the table from Jake Morrison, having their first real conversation. He was intelligent and well-spoken, with a dry sense of humor that surprised her. Before the war, he had been a schoolteacher as well as helping his father with the ranch. He spoke about books and poetry, about the changing face of the frontier, about everything except the war that had changed him so dramatically. Margaret found herself relaxing in his presence in a way she hadn't with anyone since her accident. "You're not from around here," he observed as Mrs. Henderson refilled their coffee cups. Margaret felt her cheeks flush. "No, I came from Kansas City. I was supposed to be married, but things didn't work out." She touched her veil self-consciously. Jake's expression grew serious. "You know about that. Small town. Word gets around." His jaw tightened with what looked like anger. "Tom Whitmore's a fool and a coward. Any man who would judge a woman by scars on her face isn't worthy of her." The simple statement, spoken with such conviction, hit Margaret like a physical blow. She stared at him across the table, this man who understood rejection and loneliness better than anyone, and felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since the fire, she felt truly seen by another person. Their friendship developed slowly over the following weeks. Jake began stopping by the boarding house more frequently, always with some practical excuse. His wound needed checking. He wanted to thank Mrs. Henderson for her kindness. He had questions about a recipe. But Margaret knew he was really coming to see her. Just as she began looking forward to his visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. They would sit on the front porch in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing. Jake told her about his ranch, his dreams of expanding it someday, his love for the wild beauty of the frontier. Margaret spoke about her childhood in Missouri, her love of reading, her hopes for the future that seemed less impossible when she was with him. Neither of them spoke directly about their scars or the events that had created them, but the understanding lay between them like a bridge. One evening in October, as the first frost painted the window panes silver, Jake arrived at the boarding house carrying a book. "I thought you might like this," he said, handing her a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman. "It's not exactly proper for a lady, but you strike me as someone who appreciates honesty in writing." Margaret accepted the book with hands that trembled slightly. No one had given her a gift since the fire, and the simple gesture moved her more than she could express. She opened it to find an inscription on the title page, "For Margaret, who sees beauty where others see only scars." Jakey. That night, she read the entire book by lamplight, marveling at Whitman's celebration of the human spirit in all its forms. When she came to Song of Myself, with its radical acceptance of physical imperfection and spiritual beauty, she wept with a mixture of pain and joy. Jake had given her more than a book. He had given her a new way of seeing herself. The first snow came early that year, blanketing Cedar Ridge in pristine white that made everything look clean and new. Margaret was chopping vegetables for Mrs. Henderson's soup when she heard commotion in the street. Looking out the window, she saw Jake's horse again standing riderless, but this time there was a crowd gathered around something in the snow. She ran outside without her coat, her heart pounding with fear. Jake was lying unconscious in the street, blood staining the snow around his head, while Dr. Henley knelt beside him. The crowd murmured among themselves about how he shouldn't be riding alone, how his war injuries made him too unstable, how it was only a matter of time before something like this happened. "Ozzy?" Margaret couldn't finish the question. "He's alive," Dr. Henley said grimly, "but he's taken a serious blow to the head. We need to get him somewhere warm immediately." Without hesitation, Margaret stepped forward. "Bring him to the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson and I will take care of him." For 3 days, Margaret barely left Jake's bedside. She changed his bandages, spooned broth between his lips when he was semi-conscious, and read aloud from the book of poetry he had given her. Mrs. Henderson watched her with knowing eyes, but said nothing about the devotion she showed to a man she claimed was merely a friend. On the 4th day, Jakey's eyes opened and focused on her face. "Margaret." His voice was weak but clear. "I'm here," she said, taking his good hand in both of hers. "You're going to be all right." He studied her face for a long moment, taking in the worry lines around her eyes, the exhaustion in her features, the way she had clearly been crying. "You stayed with me." "Of course I stayed with you. Even though I'm all." He gestured vaguely at his scarred face, his damaged body. Margaret felt something break open inside her chest, all the walls she had built around her heart crumbling in an instant. "Jake Morrison, you are the most beautiful man I have ever known. Your scars don't change that. They never could." His eyes filled with tears, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then he lifted his good hand to her face, his fingers gentle as they traced the edge of her own scars. "You're beautiful," he whispered. "You have always been beautiful to me." Margaret leaned into his touch, feeling whole for the first time since the fire. We're quite a pair, aren't we? Two broken people who somehow found each other. Not broken, Jake said firmly, marked by life maybe. Tested by hardship, but not broken. Never broken. They were married on a cold December morning in the small church at the edge of town. Margaret wore a simple blue dress instead of white, and she left her veil at home. Jake stood beside her in his best suit, his scarred face proud and unashamed. The congregation was small, Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Henley, a few neighbors who had come to know and respect both of them. But it felt perfect. Thomas Whitmore was conspicuously absent, though Margaret heard later that he had left town entirely, unable to face the judgment of people who had witnessed his cowardice. She felt no satisfaction in his departure, only pity for a man who would never understand that true beauty comes from courage, kindness, and the willingness to love despite the risk of being hurt. The ranch Jake took her to was small but well maintained, with a sturdy house that faced the endless expanse of prairie. Margaret had worried that the isolation might feel oppressive after months of living in town, but she found the silence peaceful, the vast sky liberating. Here, there were no curious stares, no whispered comments, no need to hide or apologize for their appearance. Jake had been self-sufficient for years, but Margaret brought her own skills to their partnership. She planted a kitchen garden behind the house, established a small chicken coop, and began making improvements to the interior that transformed the sparse bachelor quarters into a real home. More importantly, she brought laughter back into Jake's life, something that had been missing since the war. Their first winter together was harsh, with blizzards that lasted for days and temperatures that made stepping outside dangerous. But they had each other, and the long evenings by the fire became precious times of closeness and sharing. Jake taught Margaret to play chess, and she read aloud from books borrowed from the town's small library. They planned improvements to the ranch, dreamed about the future, and slowly began to heal the wounds that went deeper than scars. Spring brought new challenges. A late freeze killed half of Margaret's garden, and they lost 3 calves to wolves. Jake's war injuries made it difficult for him to handle some of the heavier ranch work alone, and they struggled financially as they learned to work as a team. But they persevered, supporting each other through every setback and celebrating every small victory. It was during their second spring that Margaret discovered she was with child. The news filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. She had always wanted children, but had assumed after the fire that no man would ever want to build a family with her. Now, carrying Jake's child, she felt as if all her dreams were finally coming true. The pregnancy was difficult, complicated by the limited medical care available on the frontier and Margaret's own fears about her body's ability to carry a child to term. Jake was endlessly patient and supportive, taking over household duties when she was too sick to manage them, and reading medical books borrowed from Dr. Henley to better understand what she was going through. Their daughter was born on a blazing hot day in August, arriving so quickly that Dr. Henley barely made it to the ranch in time. Margaret had feared throughout the pregnancy that the child might somehow be marked by her own scars, but Sarah Morrison was perfect, tiny and red-faced and squalling with healthy lungs. Jake wept openly as he held his daughter for the first time. This man who had thought he would never have a family of his own. As Margaret recovered from the birth, she watched Jake with their daughter and marveled at the transformation parenthood had brought to both of them. The careful walls they had both built around their hearts had been completely demolished by the force of their love for this tiny person who depended on them completely. Jake, who had been so self-conscious about his appearance, seemed to forget about his scars entirely when he was caring for Sarah. The years that followed brought both joys and challenges. They added to their herd gradually, expanding the ranch within their modest means. Sarah grew into a bright, curious child who saw nothing unusual about her parents' scars and accepted them as simply part of who they were. Margaret had 2 more children, a son named Samuel and another daughter, Mary, each birth easier than the last as her confidence grew. The children changed everything about how others saw Jake and Margaret. When the family came to town for supplies or church services, people focused on the bright, happy children rather than their parents' scars. Sarah, in particular, had inherited her father's charm and her mother's gentle nature, and she would chatter easily with anyone who would listen, unconsciously breaking down barriers that had existed for years. On Sarah's 5th birthday, Margaret stood in the kitchen of their ranch house, watching through the window as Jake taught his daughter to ride her first pony. His movements were still limited by his war injuries, but his patience and gentleness with the child were infinite. Sarah had no fear of falling because she trusted her father completely, just as Margaret had learned to trust in their love, despite all the reasons the world had given her to believe she was unworthy of it. "Mama, look," Sarah called out as she managed to guide the pony in a small circle on her own. Margaret stepped outside, applauding her daughter's achievement, and Jake turned to smile at her with the same expression of wonder he had worn on their wedding day. "Remember when you thought no one would ever see past your scars?" he asked quietly as Sarah continued her riding lesson. Margaret reached up to touch the marks on her face, scars that had faded considerably over the years but would never completely disappear. "Sometimes I can barely remember feeling that way. It seems like a different person's life." "You were always beautiful," Jake said, echoing the words he had spoken to her that first day she tended his wounds. "You just needed someone who knew how to look properly." That evening, after the children were in bed, Margaret and Jake sat on their front porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. The ranch had grown over the years, the house expanded to accommodate their family, the barn rebuilt and enlarged. But the view was the same as it had been on their wedding night, an endless expanse of possibility stretching to the horizon. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Tom Whitmore hadn't abandoned you at that train station?" Jake asked. Margaret considered the question seriously. "I think I would have spent my whole life trying to be what someone else wanted me to be instead of learning who I really was. I would have been grateful for scraps of affection instead of knowing I deserved real love." She reached over to take his hand, her fingers intertwining with his as naturally as breathing. "The fire that marked my face was the worst thing that ever happened to me, but in a strange way, it was also the best. It brought me to you, to this life, to our children. It taught me that real love isn't about perfect faces or unmarked skin. It's about perfect understanding." Jake lifted their joined hands to his lips, kissing her scarred knuckles with the same reverence he had shown on their wedding day. "Tom Whitmore's loss was my salvation. I was dying slowly out here alone, convincing myself that scars made a man unfit for love. You saved my life as surely as if you'd pulled me from a burning building." In the distance, a coyote called out to the stars, and somewhere in the house, one of their children stirred and settled back into sleep. Margaret felt the deep contentment that came from a life built on truth rather than pretense, on acceptance rather than shame. She and Jake had found each other in their brokenness and discovered that two wounded hearts could create something whole and beautiful and enduring. The train whistle that had once signaled abandonment and despair now meant only that the world continued beyond their ranch, full of people still searching for what she and Jake had found in each other. Margaret no longer envied those unmarked by tragedy or untested by hardship. She had learned that the deepest beauty often came from surviving the worst pain, and that love worth having was love that saw scars as proof of survival rather than evidence of unworthiness. As the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, Margaret Morrison smiled and knew that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person she was meant to love, living exactly the life she was meant to live. The scars would always be part of her story, but they were no longer the end of it. They were simply the beginning of everything that mattered.